Welcome back to Angular Gechev, the podcast where we dive into everything Angular, hot trends, key updates, and all the behind-the-scenes details. I'm Garek.
And I'm Sonu.
Today we have a really exciting episode lined up for you. We're thrilled to welcome back a familiar face from the Angular team, Minko Gechev.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Minko. So first of all, welcome back to the show. It's always good to see you. How's it going?
Good. Yeah, glad to be back. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Let's jump straight in because there's so much to cover. Angular 19 just dropped and it's bringing some exciting changes. So let's start with a big one. What excites you the most in this release?
Yeah, my highlight for this release is probably the developer preview of incremental hydration. It's something that we have been kind of thinking about for a while, and kind of we built the prerequisite to finally ship this feature.
Cool. Yeah, I'm sure developers are going to love it. Now, speaking of, developer experience, how does Angular 19 make things even smoother compared to like the previous versions?
Yeah, it's a lot of things like enabling you to, incremental hydration is specifically focused on performance. So I wouldn't say necessarily, impacting developer experience in a way that you would be able to easier do these initial load time optimizations. It's kind of like a general question. We shipped a lot of things, I guess, that improve developer experience, like linked signals, resource, and reactivity APIs. We finally graduated to stable our inputs, outputs, queries, and we provide schematics that allow you to update to your projects with these new APIs, including also schematics to move you to inject-based dependency injection and the new build system. There is a way to configure the router so that you can pre-render, server-side render, or client-side render individual routes. You have this very finely granular configuration. And we have about 2,700 thumbs up worth of more features, or even more, on GitHub.
Yeah, thanks for wrapping all the key improvements and features. So let's talk about something that has been on everyone's mind lately, reactivity, right? It has transformed the way many developers approach their work, actually. So what's new in reactivity in Angular 19?
So we have been moving Angular towards optional Zone.js, like we call it zoneless Angular, where you'll be able to update your view based on model changes without depending on Zone.js. And signals are a very core part of it. So to make sure that the zoneless journey is smooth, our team spent a good amount of time updating internal projects, kind of Google projects to zoneless. One of them that we worked on is Google Fonts. So if you go to fonts.google.com, you shouldn't see Zone.js there. Depends on the region that you're in. In some regions, we still haven't rolled out the changes. And while we were looking at the migration, we discovered that there are a couple of primitives that were missing that would just reduce boilerplate and make it easier for developers to build apps. So that's how we developed linked signal. We were thinking about how do we want to call it? Do we want to call it linked signal or writable computed or something like that? Since it acts very much like computed, except that you can set actually its value. And we also worked on a new resource API. It's for people from the AngularJS days, familiar with AngularJS, we sometimes make comparison between the old resource API in AngularJS and this resource API, with the difference that this one is using signals.
Okay, so while we're on the topic of signals and zoneless, which is a huge step forward, and you mentioned one of the challenges that you have seen with the Google Fonts application, right? Are there any other challenges that you have faced to make zoneless stable? Like what is the current progress? For example, I know a lot of developers are curious about how far we are from a fully stable zoneless Angular version.
Yeah. Our goal for 2025 is to graduate to developer preview. There are no any major API changes, but since change detection has a lot of kind of semantics, like we call change detection in particular way, and you execute it in particular order in the component tree, triggering particular like lifecycle hooks. All this has implications in testing. So there are a lot of kind of hidden details that we can potentially break by moving to zoneless, and that's what we're mostly working on, to make sure that everything is clear. We have well-defined behavior, and we have as few breaking changes as possible. I'll say for most applications, it will be relatively straightforward to move to zoneless. All you need to do is just, if all your components are using on push, and this means that they're very much zoneless compatible already. So for folks who are interested in zoneless, I recommend them to just experiment with it in their existing projects and see what works, what it doesn't. And for new projects at Google, actually, we enabled it by default for like a specific subset of projects that are using a specific serving stack. So we're pretty confident, but there is a risk that internal things may change that could potentially break your tests, let's say. And once we're confident in that layer, we're going to release it in developer preview, and after that, stable.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting. So speaking of these changes, something Alex Rukabo mentioned recently at NG Poland that caught our attention was he talked about rebranding the change detection to synchronization. That's a bold name change. Is it just a rebranding, or is there a deeper story here?
Yeah, I saw this tweet online actually. I wouldn't say that that's something that we have universally decided on. I don't mind either one of the names. Like, the way that Angular change detection functions nowadays is different compared to before. Previously, we had more of this dirty checking, global dirty checking, which was this change detection. Now it is significantly way better informed thanks to signals. So we can mark individual components or even parts of their templates potentially as dirty, where we can directly synchronize the view model with the view. So yeah, there are some subtleties, and it could potentially make sense to use a different terminology for our change detection. But that's pretty much its evolution, moving from this global dirty checking to this more kind of fine-grained reactivity with signals.
So do you plan to introduce any signal change detection?
Yeah, well, currently with zoneless, change detection is kind of triggered by signals to an extent. Not only signals, also user events in your application. But let's say you have a signal binding within your component. If your signal binding changes, we're going to mark this component template as dirty. So you already have this signal-driven change detection in a way with experimental zoneless.
Correct, but right now it's working only with on-push change detection, right? If you have still the default change detection, it checks always. So regardless of the signal changes, it will trigger the entire component tree.
Yeah, it will trigger the entire component tree.
Gotcha.
We can discuss potentially having change detection signal, like change detection type signal or signal components. We have been discussing different APIs where everything is triggered by signals and it is finer grained. Instead of being associated with the entire component template, it is associated with a particular view. Let's say the views are fragments of the template that are rendered by, let's say, ng switch, or currently the add switch, or add case, I guess, add if, and add for. In this case, we'll be able to mark only this individual fraction as dirty, and we'll be checking only it for changes or synchronizing only this part of the template.
Awesome. Let's shift a little bit to SSR and hydration you did mention at the beginning. So those are also a huge topics right now. And incremental hydration has been one of the flagship features of Angular 19. So why is this such a game changer, and how does it improve performance and user experience?
Yeah. So usually when you server-side render your application, the browser is going to get the markup of the page, the HTML, and it is going to render it. And at this point, it is going to start loading all the scripts associated with the page. So the more scripts you load, the slower it will take for your application to bootstrap and to become interactive. And this means that the less JavaScript you have, the faster your application is going to become interactive, which means that ideally you'd want to reduce the amount of JavaScript that you're loading. And there are some ways to do that. We have been talking about using lazy loading, encouraging people to use lazy loading or to delay third-party dependencies. These are pretty much the main techniques. And with hydration, it's been not really trivial to like cut part of your page and load only what is actually necessary for the user. You could potentially do that by manually bootstrapping parts of your page, but it's pretty error prone. It's not a trivial thing to do. And if you start doing that for every single page in your application to bootstrap only the components that the user is interacting with, eventually you're going to just lose this mapping between a component and a particular part in the domain. You're going to face issues. So what we did with incremental hydration is to make this simpler. Using deferred blocks, you can wrap different parts of your template in deferred blocks and specify that you would like these parts of your templates to get hydrated and become interactive only when a particular condition is met. This could be a user interaction with this part of the DOM tree. This could be, let's say, when the browser is idle. And we have other triggers as well, even a timeout trigger, which I don't see particularly applicable, but it is there if people need it. So with incremental hydration, when the browser downloads the HTML of the page, it doesn't necessarily hydrate anything until the user interacts, let's say, with a particular DOM element. From there, Angular will figure out what is the JavaScript responsible for handling this event. It is going to download the JavaScript that is responsible for that part, hydrate this part of the componentry, and replay the event so that we can handle the user interaction. And it is pretty powerful because it exactly reduces the amount of JavaScript that you need in order to handle the first user interaction. So from there, it speeds up your total blocking time, reduces it, and it makes your interaction to next paint or INP faster. Yeah, it's a lot of information about it.
Yeah, it is. On the topic of performance, how do you measure the benefits, that hydration brings? Like, are there any specific benchmarks or strategies that teams can adopt?
Yeah, just keeping track of your core web vitals and your total blocking time. Total blocking time, I believe it's not a necessary part of core web vitals, but you're always going to see it in Lighthouse. Keep track of these metrics. And a couple of things that you need to keep in mind is nesting deferred blocks, which is not considered a best practice necessarily because you have a waterfall, and also preloading or prefetching some of these deferred blocks. This is something that could speed up subsequent like page interactions. And the Angular team on the other side, we are evaluating the usefulness of partial hydration or incremental hydration by looking at all the public domains we have access to, seeing which of them have recently introduced incremental hydration and tracking how their core web vitals metrics changed. We're still early. We released the feature about a month ago. So we haven't seen that much adoption just yet. After New Year, we're going to do some more like tracking and work also with close partners to figure out how incremental hydration improve their metrics.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So another challenge developers often face with SSR are third-party libraries. So has Angular 19 introduced any techniques, tools to make this integration easier?
What do you mean by challenges with third-party libraries?
I mean, not every tool is SSR compatible, right? And sometimes you have to use like the D3 charts in your project, for example, which are not well compatible and well integrated with SSR. So are there any specific techniques, any kind of options that developers have to improve this integration and make things easier?
Well, we have different hooks that you can use in order to plug rendering logic when run rendering logic only on the client for such scenarios. That's something that I think we shipped a couple of versions ago. So not necessarily particularly like a feature from version 19, but yeah, that's something that I would recommend you to have a look at after render, after next render. These are hooks you probably want to be aware of if you have direct DOM manipulations, including using libraries that have such manual DOM manipulations.
Okay, so let's switch to testing. So Angular 19 introduced experimental support for Jest and Web Test Runner. That's a big move, especially since Karma is set to be deprecated in 2025. So are there any plans to make Jest the default testing framework moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's another feature. We shipped it, I think maybe version 16 or so, or 17, I think, actually. Yeah, definitely we're going to move away from Karma. Something that we did in version 19 is to introduce like Karma support in the ES build base builder, in the app builder, so that existing projects using Karma can use to the new build system. Yeah, we're trying to pick the best test runner right now for Angular developers that would serve their use cases. I don't think this is going to be Jest necessarily, because Jest first doesn't have great maintenance model right now. It's nobody is really too invested in maintaining it at the moment. If you look at the pulse of the projects on GitHub, another issue with Jest that we see is that you don't have real browser testing. Everything is running in Node.js, and some people really want to test their code in the browser because that's where it usually gets executed. So we have been looking at alternatives. Web Test Runner is something that meets these requirements. It is well maintained, and it allows you to run your tests actually in the browser. We have been also looking at vtest that has the same guarantees. It's significantly more popular right now compared to Web Test Runner. So we'll do some kind of evaluations. We'll see which tool works the best for Angular, and from there we're going to ship something next year.
Awesome. Just to confirm, the decision has been already made, so the Karma will be deprecated next year.
I believe so, yeah. The team maintaining Karma is the Google Web Tests team. And I believe that's a decision that we reached, that Karma will be deprecated next year.
Yeah, looking forward to some big announcements. So let's touch on security for a moment. Angular 19 introduced stricter content security policies by default. And this is a significant step towards enhancing the security of modern web applications. So why is it so crucial?
Yeah, well, CSP is something that has been around for a while, and recently the security team has been working on kind of enabling it kind of from the start using this hash-based CFP for inline scripts. I'd say what makes it important is that you don't really have to think about cross-site scripting at all. Like, just things will work and it will be enabled by default. It's great to have the security team at Google find opportunities for improvement in Angular and help us fill these gaps and just be leading the JavaScript web framework community overall this way. So it has been great collaborating with them. Yeah, currently this is an opt-in, I believe. You can enable the stricter content security policy in your Angular.json. I think there is an auto CSP property there that you can specify to true in your project. And yeah, as I mentioned, this is going to use like hash-based CSP for your inline scripts. It's going to enable it by default. So this requires slightly different way of loading your code. I think we're inlining now a script directly in your index.html, and we're loading your code through the script so that we can specify the hashes. So yeah, give it a try and let us know if you face any issues, because we're planning to enable it for everyone in future versions.
Awesome. So just to clarify, the previous versions of Angular are secured, right? They provided a similar CSP mechanism, but they weren't enabled by default.
Not necessarily. It's an opt-in right now. It's in developer preview, so you need to enable it, set the flag to true. It is, yeah, I'll say it is secure. We haven't heard about anyone exploiting the current Angular setup. The auto content security policy, just adding one layer on top, that would make it even harder to get cross-site scripting.
Okay, that sounds cool. Let's talk a bit about developer productivity one more time. So Angular 19 introduced instant edit refresh using HMR. Can you explain how this works and why it's a big win for developers?
Yeah, we have hot module replacement right now for styles, and we have a experimental support for templates as well. Many times probably you have been building web apps and you'd need to change a style right after you have filled some form. You want to see, let's say, how your form looks with particular style. You change your style, this refreshes your browser, and you lose your form state. Kind of pretty inconvenient. With HMR for styles, instead of having a browser refresh, we're going to send you the styles over the network. They're going to directly patch your existing application without a page refresh, without losing your state. So it's pretty convenient. It's for templates and style changes. It also allows you pretty much like instant update of the page, because we compile only this particular part of your templates and or this particular component, and we just ship it to the browser directly and we patch the page. It is pretty powerful also because it allows us to be significantly more like intentional about what part of your application we compile. We have single file compilation there, even though we don't have selectorless components yet, because we know exactly in which part of the components the change happened. You haven't changed your selector, you have changed only your styles or templates. Yeah, definitely one of the kind of coolest features, and I'm happy we made it available finally for everyone.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So let's look a little bit ahead. Feedback from the community is really important. And how did the community influence the features and priorities in Angular 19? Or in general in Angular, how the community can influence the features and priorities?
Yeah, for every release, the developers for using Angular are defining the features and are defining the roadmap pretty much, because we built the framework for developers. So we want to make developers successful with Angular. We want to make Angular popular and useful for developers. So that's why we track feedback from different sources, and wherever we find to be the most impactful, we include in the release. There are some exceptions here and there. For example, the content security policy, that's really important, but I mentioned that we haven't been exploited really before, so probably we're secure enough. But still, the security team decided that we can make Angular even more secure. So the security team, as a partner team, helped us to introduce this out to CSP. So we defined the roadmap based on developer feedback, and occasionally we get contributions from such partner teams that help us to make Angular even better. The way we collect this feedback, I would say GitHub is probably our number one source of information. So if you like to have a particular feature in Angular, or you're struggling with a particular API, make sure you submit an issue on GitHub. This doesn't guarantee that we're going to implement it, because that's one kind of request, and we have a community of millions of developers. So we want to make sure that we're intentional about what we ship, since we have limited bandwidth as well. We're around 20 people, and if we want, we can't ship every single feature request. And every single feature request might not be the best thing for us to do. We may want to group a couple of them into one, let's say. That's what we did with Reactivity. We grouped like a whole cluster of feature requests and design this reactivity system around them. Another source of information is actually social media. We listen to developers on Twitter and on Blue Sky, and all these alternative social medias there and collect feedback and consider it into our prioritization process. We talked to a lot of large teams because there is a particular type of feature requests that teams at scale have. And these teams are internal Google teams or external organizations. The feature sets are often very overlapping between internal and external teams since you're all developers. And we run developer surveys too, to once we have agreed on a direction, just to make sure that we're not missing the big picture, we run our developer surveys and validate that the feedback that we have collected and the plan that we have created based on the feedback is actually valid based on this larger sample of data from thousands of developers in our developer survey. It's a lot of source of information. Yeah, we're also constantly open to improvements in our processes.
Yeah, it's awesome to see how community voices impact, Angular's direction. So before we wrap up, what's on the horizon for Angular after v19? Can you give us a sneak peek into what's coming next?
Sure, yeah. Let me actually open the strategy for the next year so that I can give you very specific examples. So zoneless would be our P0 priority, just to make sure we graduate to developer preview. I would say production ready might not be achievable for the next year, just because we need to go through thousands of tests and many applications and make sure that everything is really stable until we graduate zoneless to stable. But developer preview, I think it's pretty reasonable. We will be working on signal forms. That's one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we have heard both from Googlers and from external developers, that the signal story could be better. We can have only one way of creating forms, and this could serve both template driven and reactive forms. And we can have a reactive forms implementation through signals. We have been also working on making RxJS optional. So these reactive forms that we currently have, they don't have the best integrations, let's say, with signals. We have some RxJS interop package functions that could help us improve this integration, but we can be a little bit more intentional about it and make it easier for developers to adopt signals with reactive forms and with template driven forms. We will do the same for the router and for the HTTP client. Something that I'm particularly excited about is an RFC about simplified component authoring experience with selectorless. We're planning to make selectors optional so that we can reduce indirection and double imports and also speed up compilation. Because with selectorless, our build process becomes significantly simpler, which means that we can have per file compilation and have HMR-like experience even for component changes. We can compile individual files and directly push them to the browser for re-rendering or page refresh. So these are some of my favorites for the next year. We have plenty of more plans. I'm looking at a 13-page document right now, but these are some of my personal favorites.
Wow, that sounds really awesome, and it looks like you have a lot of things to do for the next year. This has been a really absolutely packed session and so much exciting stuff happening in Angular 19, and I think developers are going to walk away with a tons of great takeaways today. What do you think, Sonu?
Yeah, absolutely. Minko, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all the amazing knowledge. Always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and make sure you subscribe to Angular Gechev for more deep dives into all things Angular.
Stay tuned for more great content, and as always,
Happy coding!